Got it. Okay. Hello, everyone. If you're in the queue for food, hopefully you can hear us. My name is Daniel Tishner. I am the co-director of the Wayne Morse Center and a professor in political science. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our 2024 election roundtable for tonight. If you are not on our email or snail mail list, you can sign up and back. And you can learn about what other events are coming up, which I'll mention one of them in a second. And please also consider giving to the Wayne Morse Center. For those of you who've been to other events know that I have a shtick on this. I'll be really brief about it tonight, which is we don't have dedicated funds either from the university or the state, which means like Oregon Public Broadcasting, we rely on donations, whether it's $5, 500, 5,000. So you can either look at this QR code, or we have old-fashioned envelopes to which you can give. So that's my plea if you want to support events like this, to please consider giving to us. Next Thursday at 6 p.m., we'll be hosting labor leader Sarah Nelson, who's the international president of the Association of Flight Attendants. She will be delivering our Margaret Hollick lecture this year, and her talk is titled, "Start at the Workplace, the Politics Will Follow." And I think, it strikes me as an especially prescient approach as folks think about, what does one do after the election and so forth as strategies. So again, Sarah Nelson in this room at 6 p.m. So please join us. For tonight's event, we're going to be taking questions via cards. And so at the end of most rows are cards and pencils. And so if you're inspired with a question, we have event ambassadors who also, like me, have a Morse sticker. And so if you have a question, just wave it and they'll come gather them up. And when we get to the end, they will raise questions. We also have, for those who are in live stream, thank you for being here and welcome. On the entry page for the live stream, you'll see the phone number in which you can also text in your questions, which our Associate Director, Abby Stilley, will be fielding. So with that, I want to call up my co-director, Rebecca Dinwoody, who has a few messages for us.
Yeah, you don't have to clap. I'll be brief because we have such a great panel today, but I do just want to acknowledge the moment. We had a very significant election 2 days ago, and people are bringing into this room and online a lot of different emotions about it. Because we are a center that welcomes dialogue, and civil discourse. We want folks to know that you are welcome, whoever you voted for. And I want to acknowledge also some of the feelings that people might be having. Some folks might be happy about the result of the election or be curious about a policy position that they think, it's important to try. Some might feel like neither political party represents or cares about their issues. So you might not be feeling a lot of things. And then there are others who are feeling grief, despair, fear for their own safety and the safety of folks they love and communities they don't even know. And I will say, before I came up on stage, I heard about an incident. I don't know much about it, but here at the University of Oregon, where Trump supporters were targeted. And so I just want to say we're feeling a lot of feelings. I want to think of this as a relatively safe container where we can exchange ideas. I asked to have our time here extended. So afterwards, if you want to come, circle up over here and just talk about what you're feeling or ask more questions or just see other people face to face who might have different ideas, please join me over there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. So the first half of our event is going to really be featuring a conversation and some discussion just with panelists. But then hopefully the other half will be questions from you. And again, logistics, if you don't have a card and you have something that's pressing, if you kind of raise your hand, I'm hoping that one of our ambassadors will come find you. With that, we have an all-star panel. I'm so grateful to them for being here with us to share their expertise and wisdom. And so I'll just rattle off folks in alphabetical order. Representative Peter DeFazio, Senior Fellow at the Wayne Moore Center, who served for 36 years in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing our own 4th District. He's the longest-serving member of Congress in Oregon history. His impressive track record as a lawmaker earned him the appellation the Tiger of the House. Allison Gash, professor and department head of political science, does work focusing on the intersection of law and social policy with a specific interest in race, gender, sexuality, and disability. And before I get to the next person, I'll say these are all really short bios. Hopefully, if you go online, you can see how long the record is for each of these folks. Just really impressive. But if I go through it all, it will take about another 20 minutes. Professor Chandler James, assistant professor of political science and an expert of the American presidency, public opinion, and political behavior. Dr. Regina Lawrence is the associate dean of the School of Journalism and Communication in Portland, research director for the Agora Journalism Center, and an authority on political communication, civic engagement, gender and politics, and the role of media in public discourse about politics and policy. Dr. Neil O'Brien is assistant professor in political science whose scholarship focuses on public opinion, political parties, and polarization. And if you attend our Morse bookmarks, you may have heard him talking about his fantastic new book, which helps us understand polarization, out with the University of Chicago Press, if you want to go on Amazon.com and help him buy a few meals. Okay, so I want to take 90 seconds at the top to note a few significant facts following Tuesday's results. 90% of all U.S. counties shifted to the right in this election. Trump is the first GOP candidate for president since 2004 to win a majority of the popular vote. But he will end up with 2 to 3 million votes less than his 77 million in 2020. Harris also had fewer votes than Biden's in 2020, 14 to 15 million fewer votes. Both of those data points highlight that the turnout for this election was down. Millions of people stayed home who voted in the last presidential election. Finally, 2 other things I can't resist mentioning as a presidential scholar. That is, Trump is the oldest person elected to office. He's also, as you know, the first convicted felon. He is the second non-consecutive person elected. Anyone know the first? Grover Cleveland, Gilded Age. So 1880s, 1890s. And by the way, Grover Cleveland, one of the kerfuffles with him is he was opposed to the tariff. So there's a little Trivial Pursuit factoid. So To get us rolling, Neil, I know you've been looking at exit polls and voting patterns, and to get us rolling, what stands out to you in your assessment so far? And as an expert on partisan and ideological polarization, has something shifted on this score, or are we as profoundly divided as ever?
Yeah, so I think a couple broad trends, one which you highlighted by discussing a broad shift at the county level. You also see that really among nearly every demographic group. It seems like there is largely, broadly speaking, a shift to the right. It's been pronounced among young men, pronounced among Hispanic and Latino voters. So it's a shift to the right across the board. One thing that's stood out, and there's a lot that's going to be discussed and investigated, and more data will come to bear. But it does seem, one thing looking at the returns is that red areas seem to be getting redder, and then there were pockets of the country that seem to be getting bluer. So it does seem like, in some ways, just polarization has been entrenched in this election.
Great, thank you. And let me just say, you all, we want this to be conversational. If these first questions are to each of you, but you all should feel like you can jump in responding to folks, and after these first few questions, that'll be really easy to do. Okay. So Regina, in her concession address yesterday, Vice President Harris said that sometimes the fight takes a while. In terms of electing a female president, that fight, at least by my addition, is 241 years and counting. You wrote one of my favorite books on gender politics and Hillary Clinton's earlier race for the White House. And so if you were to write a coda for that book on Harris and gender politics in 2024, what kinds of things do you think you might want to highlight?
Thank you for that wonderful question. Obviously, what Hillary Clinton described as the highest, hardest glass ceiling remains unshattered this week. But one thing that Melody Rose and I wrote about in that book is that obviously every female candidate, particularly in presidential politics, has a very large context of, longstanding gender stereotypes, prejudices, et cetera, to deal with, which then is, of course, very much complicated for a non-white female candidate to negotiate or to navigate. But we also talk about how every female candidate works within her own context as well. And the context for Kamala Harris, I would argue, maybe even outshadows to some extent the effects of gender and race in this election, or at least I think that's worth considering. And I would just briefly point out that her context would have been tremendously difficult even for a highly skilled male politician, I think, to overcome, having entered the race as the nominee with literally 3 months to campaign, saddled with the association with a deeply unpopular administration that I think many of us did not fully realize how unpopular that administration really had become.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Peter, Tyler Harper recently noted that the anger, in quotes, the anger and resentment we may have thought was pitched at a simmer turned out to be a rollicking boil. Apropos what Regina was just saying, one that has, as he puts it, given birth to a multiracial working class movement drawn to Trumpism. Nicholas Kristof writes that Democrats often have a knack for coming across as remarkably condescending to working class voters. So my question is, for you is, are they right that Democrats, especially at the top of the ticket, have become inept at appealing to the working class voters who once anchored it? And if so, what's the solution?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we even had unions refusing to endorse in this case. It all started with Bill Clinton and NAFTA and the WTO. We don't care about you. We're exporting your jobs to Mexico. People were actually made to, people came up from Mexico. They had to show them how to use the machines and unbolt the machines and pack them up and ship them down. There were documentaries done at the time. And in '94, the Midwest stayed home. The Rust Belt stayed home. We lost the House, brought in Newt Gingrich. Then Obama comes, hope and change. People were like, yeah, we really want change in this country. And what did he do? Trans-Pacific Partnership. We're going to have NAFTA worldwide on steroids. And he didn't prosecute one Wall Street crook. 3 million people lost their homes. So they don't feel like Democrats give a damn about the working class in this country. We're losing working class people of every race and gender. And we have to go back, and this, I will hope that Sarah was a good friend of mine, and you should hear her. She may lift you up a little bit and inspire you. That we have to recapture. The Democrats have been the party of the working class in America. We can't win elections on college-educated elites and others. We have to get back to basics that relate to people's daily lives. And, you know, Kamala did a greater job as she could have done with the time she had. We should have had a real election. Biden should have met out a year ago. She could have sharpened her answers during the primary, or not survived the primary, because she couldn't say what she would do different. And he is so unpopular, and immigration and inflation economy are at the top of that. She didn't have a chance.
Thank you. So Allison, shifting from economic class to the culture wars, I think you know this well. Trump's team spent most of its ad money, 42%, in the last month on transgender attack ads. There was, at the same time, I want to have a positive note, Sarah McBride of Delaware is the first transgender person elected to Congress.
Yep.
Can you talk about queer and trans rights and their role in this campaign? And do you have recommendations on the long game on LGBTQIA membership and belonging?
Well, so one really interesting factoid, if the exit polls are to be believed, is that there actually was a shift leftward for LGBTQ voters by quite a bit. So I think it's something like 88% of LGBTQ voters ended up voting for Harris. And so that's an interesting number. It's not surprising, given the fact that a large percentage of Republican public officials have rallied around a couple of very specific agenda items, right? Book bans around LGBTQ-centered books and authors, and then a deeply visceral anti-trans agenda around blocking healthcare options, and then also really targeting trans female athletes. And you know, certainly the narratives, right? The sort of fear-mongering that was put forth in a lot of the ads that emerged in the last few weeks of the election around children going into schools and getting gender surgery and coming back from school suddenly a different gender. Right, these are ads that really stoked fears in a lot of counties. And, you know, it certainly was built on, you know, roughly 2-year campaign that was launched by several conservative organizations, right, to really hone in on gay and lesbian, but especially trans individuals in that community. And we've seen those state-by-state efforts be hugely successful. And so it's not surprising that it ended up activating a huge turnout for Trump. In terms of onward, I mean, I think there's a lot of blame happening right now within the queer and trans community. You've got sort of a predictable backlash against younger trans rights activists about the degree to which the focus on trans rights in the Democratic Party maybe sort of, you know, produced these sorts of narratives that were being put forth by Trump. And then you've got, of course, that backlash happening from young queer people about Democratic moderates not spending enough time talking about queer issues. I mean, Kamala hardly mentioned queer and trans people at all. Other people did, but they weren't really sort of focused on at the convention. So I don't know where to move forward, but there's a lot of consternation in the community right now. Thanks,
Allison. So Chandler, I know you've thought carefully about candidates' political identities and the electorate's response. And I think it was just last Friday, I've heard you reflect eloquently on the diploma divide, racial identities, and multiracial democracy in this election. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts about the candidates' identities and voter responses after Tuesday?
So Trump ran an unconventional campaign in the sense that he was, I would say, openly racist and openly sexist, and openly transphobic. There was no concern about that for him, and there was hardly any backlash because really, when you're looking at Trump, there's so many scandals and issues swirling around him at any one point that it was hard to really focus on this particular aspect, but questioning Harris's racial identity, talking about his beautiful white skin, talking about a lot of the, again, this 30,000 transphobic ads, and it worked. This unconventional political style worked very well and won a clear majority in the election. And so what that says to me is that many of the norms that we thought constrained presidential decorum are no longer relevant. And so I think Harris, on the other hand, was working hard to present herself as competent, capable, in line with the traditions and practices of the American presidency and American norms. And I remember I was at the Democratic National Convention. They would hand out flags, American flags, and she really tried to embrace many of the symbols and kind of practices of normative behavior. And in some ways, I wonder if that was maybe a wrong mistake, a wrong choice. Trying to embrace the flag when the that's not going to move any Republican. They have their own notion of the American identity. And so, you know, it was trying to triangulate with symbols in a world where the symbols of authority and establishment are no longer credible to working class people whose communities are blighted out. And they don't find that same sense of connection to authority and legitimacy that once existed, I think in part because they feel like the elites have sold them down the drain.
Thank you. So I feel like I have to ask the obligatory Monday morning quarterback question, which I know is a little irritating, but were there things that the Harris campaign might have emphasized in their strategy that if they had done some things different in campaign strategy would have made a difference? Or was she basically, you know, because of structural reasons, going to lose from the jump in retrospect?
I have thought about this particular question a lot. I mean, obviously, the campaign was very condensed. Her campaign was very condensed, and it was a real challenge for her to present herself. But I do think that there was enough time for her to establish an identity. She never broke with Biden. And I remember I watched several interviews of her try to give her regarding questions about the economy and immigration. And there was, I remember one question in particular in which she was asked about a change in Biden policy which made border crossing illegal again. And like he asked her, like, do you regret what changed? Like, why did you switch? And she alluded to this bipartisan immigration bill led by a conservative member of the Senate from Oklahoma 4 times. And she said, you know what I'm going to say? I'm going to say that Trump torpedoed this bill. However, that doesn't explain anything about what you would do or about who you are. And so I think that there was a real reluctance for her to engage in the nitty-gritty of policy in terms of explaining what kind of president she would be, what kind of person she is. And I think that this is a part of a maybe wrong strategy about what works in political campaigns. So many people think that this is a science, right? And that you can micro-target, and if you knock on enough doors and you raise enough money and you do meet all these quantitative benchmarks, then somehow you're going to have an effective campaign. But if you're selling something that people don't want, then it doesn't matter how much money you spend. And we saw this with Michael Bloomberg. And so I think that there was a missed opportunity in terms of establishing herself and explaining herself unfiltered. And I think that she thought that if she was disciplined and if she stayed on message, that would be able to exceed the issues that come from being a part of an unpopular administration. But she could have said, look, I was the vice president. I didn't make some of these decisions. I disagree and I would do something different. But she never chose that tact.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the, a lot of the stuff that we're seeing online right now is just, you know, this was, this was really about the economy, and this was about, previously Democratic voters or independent voters shifting rightward, but 14 million voters stayed home, right? 20 million voters stayed home, but for sure 14 million Democrats stayed home, or Democratic voters, right? So what was it that kept those voters at home on such a consequential election? It's because they didn't feel relevant, right? They didn't feel spoken to in any of the multiple opportunities that Harris had to speak to them. And I think part of it is this dynamic that Chandler is talking about, right? The fact that she never really gave a sense of who she was, but she also never really attempted to correct the many deeply problematic narratives that Trump put out there about a whole collection of marginalized people that are part of the coalition that is the Democratic Party, right? On many instances, right? There was one occasion where she talked about how she, Trump mentioned that Harris supported gender surgery, gender affirming care in prisons, and her response was, "I follow the law." Right? And also Trump followed the law. That's not narrative changing, right? There's an opportunity there to change a narrative, right? And she didn't change the narrative, and she didn't change the narrative on a lot of things. And she could have changed the narrative to bring a lot of those voters who decided to sit at home back into the voting booth. And that was a missed opportunity. And we're really not going to know what kept them home, but it has to be considered.
Yeah, to build on these excellent observations, I think one thing that really struck me was the degree to which the Harris campaign really leaned in to attacking Donald Trump, relentlessly reminding people that he's the problem, he's a threat to democracy, which many people in this room may agree with, and that may really resonate for you. I think it ended up missing the boat. In fact, if I was looking at those exit polls correctly, among the people for whom threat to democracy was a big concern, they didn't even necessarily vote for Harris. So there's a huge disconnect. And I think one person who's influenced my thinking on this is the wonderful reporter for the New York Times, is Ted Herndon, who does the podcast, The Run Up, which I highly recommend. And he he's pointing out that you can't run on threats to democracy for a population that doesn't believe in those democratic institutions, doesn't believe that those democratic institutions are working well anyway. You can't simply invoke democracy. We have to protect democracy if people don't think that democracy is working for them.
I mean, Trump was already well known. I mean, there was no reason for her to continue to try and define him. People knew what it was, what he was. The vile stuff he was saying didn't matter. I mean, it came down, I mean, his popularity is around 40%. He just got elected president with 40% popularity because this is a reaction that is being seen around the world. Some call it the COVID overhang. All the disruption of the economy, the inflation that followed, and of course, all of the government mandates, which really many people did not like, big government. And that really, it's happened in Germany, it's happened in France, it's happened in Italy, it's happened in South Africa, just happened in Japan. It's all around the world. It's a reaction to what in the last few years, and people want to see dramatic change. And he represents, for good or for bad, dramatic change.
I think one thing to add to this is, building on my colleague's point, is that this was structurally a difficult election for Harris for a variety of reasons. She, for example, didn't have the benefit of being the challenger, nor the benefit of being the incumbent. She's in this kind of in-between ground. But just stepping back a little bit, one thing that's been floating around that I think is interesting is, although there was some organization in the last few months, there was a lot of Republican Party building and voter registration in Florida, with Susie Wild, who is now poised to be potentially the chief of staff, I think. Voter registration drives in North Carolina and Pennsylvania. So this was a long buildup that the Democrats just couldn't catch up with at the end. And so I think going forward, it's thinking of it not as a campaign being just what happened in the 3 months before the election, but kind of the slow work that takes time. And it seemed like Trump and the Republicans did that over the last few years.
Thanks. I want to highlight ask you all about abortion and reproductive rights on the ballot this time. So it's striking. There were 10, right, at the state level. 7, I think, were favorable to abortion rights. 1 was kind of mixed. The other 2 weren't. But one of the things, so I wonder if you all can talk about that. But also, the thing I really want to accentuate, what's fascinating is a number of those states, you had a majority of voters who voted for abortion rights and voted for Trump. Almost like a la carte, we'll pick different things. So I wonder what you make of that. Because that's not what the Harris campaign would have predicted.
Right, exactly. I've almost wondered, I don't have anything to back this up, but I've just wondered if those ballot initiatives provided a way for people to vote for the other issues that they cared about that were driving them to vote for Trump, and also, kind of have what is it? Have your cake and eat it too, right? Have it both ways to be able to also say, and I want abortion rights protected.
Oh yeah, of course.
Just one thing on building on that point, campaigns are multidimensional, and so and there's been research done on this of what happens when you have a position that's out of line with your party or your candidate. If it's salient enough to you, you might switch the candidate, you might switch the party. If it's salient but not a top issue, you might stick with the candidate for one reason, even if you disagree on those other issues. And I think you have seen this. You saw it in Kansas, you saw it in Florida, for example, this cycle where there are abortion liberal Republicans that are still going out and voting for Trump in this case and other conservative candidates.
He skated the issue. He backed off. He knew he could afford to, that they're not going to walk away from him in the election since he was chosen by God to run. And he said, I'm not going to be for a national ban. It's up to the states. So that plays into exactly what you're saying is, I'm going to vote to protect myself in my state and my daughter or your future people. But I don't think that's going to stand. I mean, he's going to be under tremendous pressure on this.
Yeah, I mean, this is where the pivot from reproductive choice to LGBTQ issues always really works in the Republican Party's favor. I mean, this is how we got marriage equality banned and then, randomly also legalized, right? Because the Republican Party pivoted, right, in the late 80s, early 90s from reproductive choice because it just wasn't working, right? From the pro-life movement over to banning marriage equality because it just wasn't catalyzing as many people as he wanted, and so. Right, Trump was able to say, "Oh, don't worry, I'm not going to nationalize a ban on abortion, but what I am going to do is protect you from like bad gay books and gender surgeries at school." So that's part of that story. The other really interesting thing that I find fascinating is time and time again, right? There's always this sort of a set of shorthand assumptions about how voters vote. Right? So the shorthand assumption is if we have a ballot initiative that speaks to X voter, it's going to bring X voter out to vote, and then they're just going to vote in accordance to all of those particular issues, right? So if they're going to vote, to uphold abortion rights, obviously they're going to vote blue. That's just how it's done, right? And it speaks to these norms, right? These expectations of norms that I think the Democratic Party fully believed would just be upheld, and they didn't take time to think that conservative women voters aren't necessarily going to vote as a monolith, right? They're not going to vote in the way that Democratic women voters are expected to vote, right? They're going to do the a la carte part, and part of that is also because the Democratic Party hasn't been able to figure out what makes conservative women tick. It's the big giant question mark. They just cannot figure it out, right? They've had these ads that typify conservative women as victims, as not being able to break out of their deeply problematic and abusive relationships, right? There's a Julia Roberts ad that failed miserably because it really typecasted conservative women in this really problematic way, right? They just haven't been able to figure out how to reach those women, and they thought they were going to be able to do it this way, and it just didn't work.
Chandler, you're writing a really important book on presidential norms and norm breaking, comparing Obama's 2 terms and Trump's first. So I wonder if you could project forward and tell us what you expect in the second term. More of the same as the first, or is something else to be expected?
Thank you for the opportunity in plugging my book. It's not yet written, but when it is, everybody go buy it. Give me an incentive to finish up. So I have this theory of presidential norms, and it is, put simply, presidents engage with presidential norms or political norms strategically. So they don't adhere to them because they have to, right? They adhere to them because it's in their interest. And to the degree that it's in their interest, they will do it. And when they believe that there is an opportunity to violate a norm for political gain, they might do it. And it's a riskier strategy to be a norm violator than it is to be a norm adherent. But if the norms associated with a particular regime or establishment become associated with a discredited establishment, then violating the norms becomes a much more, has much more potential for benefit. And so with respect to the future of presidential norms, if the way that they're upheld is if there's some punishment for violation of the norm, like that's what it means for a thing to be a norm. If you violate a norm, you get socially ostracized, something happens negative, and that polices behavior. Trump was not policed for his norm violation. In fact, from my research, I found that in many respects, he's rewarded for norm violating behavior. So what does this say? Well, when I wrote my first paper on this subject, my first couple papers, like he was president and then he got beat. And so it was kind of like, well, what is the future? Like he was successful, he got a lot of votes, but like, you know, maybe he was punished. Biden promised this return to normalcy. Well, in 2024, that's out the window. Trump won on his norm violating populist strategy. That's the new norm, at least for a party. They're going to be acting like that for as long as that rewards them politically. And so I think the future of many of the presidential norms that Trump has violated are in question, fundamentally. And I you know, not to be dour, but that's concerning because many of these presidential norms, like facilitating a peaceful transfer of power, which Biden promised to do, makes democracy in America possible. There's no rules. If we cling to power, if leaders cling to power every time there's an election, they abandon these rules whenever it doesn't fit with what they want, then we are in this violent loop, right? And so it's concerning because a lot of these norms, I think that it's going to create the incentive for more people to violate norms, and norms such as he broke. And if they're not punished, then that means that some of the things that keep us structured and organized as a society are breaking down.
Thanks. So question for everybody. So candidate Trump, as we know, said lots of things about his policy plans, you know, tariffs, Social Security tax, mass deportation, we could rattle off a long list. So did Project 2025. So my question is, how much of this is just talk? All of it? None of it? You know, reading tea leaves, what should we expect?
Well, I can't say I know exactly what to expect, but I think today, you know, he was asked about massive deportations and if there's a budget, and he says, you know, it doesn't matter, and I'm going to do this. Now, you got to wonder at some point, the business community, especially the farm community, is going to say, wait a minute. You know, and sometimes I see Stephen Miller emphasizing criminal illegals, and they might do a big show around that and then kind of drop it. I don't know. But I mean, the disruption to this economy and what it would mean to try and actually find and deport, 12 or more million people would be unbelievably disruptive to the society. And he would use, perhaps the military in violation of posse comitatus or who knows what else. I also think he's talked about depriving sanctuary cities or states from any federal funds. They have a theory under the 2025 plan that he can impound funds, even though there was a Supreme Court ruling previously that said the president can't impound funds that have been appropriated by Congress. But what would the Supreme Court say? I don't know. And then the tariffs, Biden kept the tariffs he put in place, which were more targeted and strategic. If he went with that tariff agenda, then of course he would trigger massive inflation, and then we would see a big turnover in 2 years. But I assume that he's going to get pulled back on that. Probably do some stuff with China and maybe others. But I can't imagine that he will follow through with that whole agenda, because it would be, it'd immediately trigger inflation in this country, shortages of goods. I haven't had a chance to check it yet, but I was talking to someone last night who said there's no car made in America that has more than 76% made in America parts. So it'd be right back where we were in COVID, like, oh, we can't make new cars because we don't have chips from Taiwan. Then used car prices shoot through the ceiling, and you have this whole cycle that started. So.
Thanks, and I know others want to jump in just a second, but I want to, again, plug in just a few moments. I'd like to get people's questions. So if you have filled out your cards, if you could raise them up, then some of our ambassadors will get them. And with that, it looked like Neil wanted to jump in, and then Allison.
Peter, if I could ask a question of, let's say, a proposal to hike tariffs to 20%, or the tax cut proposals are submitted to Congress, what's the process, or what are potential pressure points or difficulties of getting that through Congress?
Well, they have a theory that they could cut capital gains unilaterally again, and I don't quite understand their theory, but they do. The rest of the tax cuts to be extended would require an action of Congress. And of course, he wants further lower corporate rates. And then he's talked about other things, that total about $8 trillion over the potential term of his presidency added to the debt, which will then put us at way over our GDP on debt, which will then make us look like Greece, and then who knows what happens there. So he's talking about economic ruin, yet the Wall Street Journal endorsed him. So it's in Wall Street went to record highs yesterday because, hey, our taxes are going to go down. But that has to get through the Congress. The tariffs, he has more latitude on tariffs than he does on taxes.
So, the question of what can he implement, or what would he likely implement? I mean, I think he's going to go after the low-hanging fruit, which are all the things that he can just do with executive orders and what are called Dear Colleagues letters, which is basically just a sort of, nice way of saying I'm going to alter an agency regulation just to scooch. And he can accomplish a good chunk of the anti-LGBTQ agenda that is written about in Project 2025 through just a letter. So I suspect, that'll be an easy mark because it can be done. There's a Supreme Court case pending that will deal with the question of access to trans healthcare. So some of that will be sort of mitigated by how the court intervenes. But, there's quite a bit that he can accomplish of that document by just changing, some of the elements of the executive branch, which is why Project 2025 focused so heavily on on the executive agencies, right? On who's in those agencies, on who's hiring, on which agencies will stick around. But that's what I think he'll focus on first.
Great. I have a question that is for Regina, but it could be for everybody on the panel, which is your thoughts on the strengths, shortcomings, and challenges for journalists covering the 2024 campaign.
How much time do we have? I'll try to be short. I've thought about this a lot, and thank you for the question. And I bet everybody here probably has thoughts about this. Obviously, covering Trump has been a challenge from the moment he entered the political scene, and I don't think journalists have still quite figured it out because it's very, very difficult. I think what I feel like I saw in this election was they felt really obliged to report every crazy statement, every problematic behavior on the campaign trail to continually say, look at this guy, look at this guy. Do you see what's happening? But I think that unfortunately there were some downsides to that for voters overall. And I think one thing that may have happened is that kind of amplifying what Chandler and others were saying. I don't think that voters learned very much about Kamala Harris. I don't think they learned very much about her campaign because, once again, Trump's really great at being the center of attention and, sucking up all the oxygen in the room. So I think there was a real downside as far as that goes. Yeah.
There was a pretty hilarious debate on academic Twitter about Nate Silver, who is this pollster. And he has these models for predicting the likelihood that one candidate or the other will win the election. And there's tremendous debate about polls and probabilities of winning and the horse race element of political campaigns. And it consumes so much of the attention. How's Kamala doing? How's Trump doing? Who's up? Who's down? The consequence of this, as Virginia was saying, is that actual reporting is decreased, right? And so, you're talking about scandals, you're talking about who's up, who's down. You're not getting into the nitty-gritty. People aren't learning valuable information. They're consumed by the competition of the race and less consumed with making an informed decision. So I think that, honestly, the media has been in turmoil for decades now as they've really tried to adjust their business model in light of TV and the internet. But, even the credible places are sensational, right? And it's in part, they're trying to attract eyeballs. But I think that it gives people an unclear sense of what's happening in the world. And so that's why I think that our role as scholars, as academics, is so important, because it's incredibly important for us to inform people about what the structures are, what's happening, how the process works. So when I went on KVAL yesterday, and I described a filibuster. And my guess is that a lot of people don't know what a filibuster is, but there's so much talk about like if the polls are off or on, right? If the polls are good or bad. But there's little discussion about basic elements of how our government operates from our media apparatus. And maybe there's this presumption that people know and they have this kind of well-read generalist readership, but I don't think that's the case. I think people are pretty woefully uninformed. I do surveys where I do political knowledge batteries. Basically the average score is 60% on questions like who controls the Senate? Who's the current Chief Justice? And it's multiple choice. It's not hard stuff. So, we have a population that, and I'm not trying to be a liberal, academic, highfalutin person dismissive of people, but we have a population that is really not well informed about how our government operates and the implications of one choice over another. And I don't think the media does a good job of drawing that out for people, and it has disastrous consequences.
Great, and now we're going to take.
Can I just,
please go ahead.
one quick. Also, remember, for decades, public education has been under attack. And that is part of the design, is to dumb down the populace in this country. And, people are not getting civics and government and all those things taught to them in school. I mean, how many times people will say, how are things in Salem? And I'd be like, yeah, well, I don't know. I haven't been there for a while. I'm working in Washington, D.C. But it's not their fault. They didn't, public education has been attacked, defunded, being overrun by court decisions with charter schools and religious schools and everything else. I think that's a big part of the problem.
Make one more point.
Sure.
Because I want to make one more point because I think this is really important. Elon Musk bought Twitter for $44 billion and turned that into a propaganda machine for Donald Trump. Turned a huge multi-billion-dollar social media company with millions and millions of people who are active on that site every day. Every time I opened up Twitter, it was Donald Trump and Elon Musk propaganda. And, you know, I'm not like necessarily off-put by that. You know, it's not the worst thing ever to see, but like, that's what's happening, right? And these media in our system, the way that you get your name out there is by the media, but they're controlled by billionaires. Jeff Bezos refused to, scuttled the endorsement of his editorial board. So increasingly, I mean, and maybe this has always been the case or long been the case, you know, people who have lots of money control these apparatuses and use them for their own purposes. And it's just important to note that, like, of course, Kamala, made some mistakes, but she's going up against a situation. I mean, our entire political system is kind of funded and controlled by billionaires' money. If you can't get some billionaire to give you money, $10 million for your super PAC, you don't have a chance. So that's something that like just needs to be repeated, because it really is not, when we talk about democracy, people having a vote and influence over our government, if it takes a billionaire to greenlight you to get an opportunity to run for office, then how much of a choice is that for voters?
Thanks.
And
So,
actually mentioned money, I was going to bring up very quickly Citizens United, which has really undone our democracy, and the fact that the IRS under Trump stopped requiring disclosure of 501c4 contributions. So now any random billionaire can channel $1 billion through a 501c4 to a super PAC, and the only disclosure is it came for people for good government. This 501c4. And that's, and that was all a consequence of something that happened under Obama, where they were supposedly targeting the Tea Party, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is, there was $4.5 billion of spent, outside money spent in this campaign, and more than half of it was dark money. It could have come from Putin. We don't know. There is no disclosure. You can't contribute, foreigners can't contribute, except what if they channel the money into a 501c4? It's done. So that is a major factor in this election. And it has hurt the Democrats too, because at first the Democrats said, this is bullshit, we're not going to do it. Now they've bought in. So now Democrats are trying to compete for the billionaire money, which restrains the positions they'd take. I mean, Bernie wasn't restrained, she was.
okay, so we are now at long last going to switch to questions from the cards, and Quinn, you're going to get us started. Okay.
All right. This one is for Peter DeFazio. Could you talk about your experience working across the aisle with Republicans when Democrats were in the minority during Trump's first term?
Well, this is part of this. You can refer to my much longer version about this, when I gave the Wayne Morris lecture this year here. But, over time, when I came to Congress, if you drew two parabolas, here's a liberal Republican and here's a conservative Democrat, there were 95 to 100 people in that space. Income Gingrich, it shrinks. Income, the Tea Party, it shrinks. Now those lines don't even intersect anymore. There's virtually no working across the aisle. When Trump, that was, it was 8 years ago. There was still a little bit of that, particularly in my committee, Transportation Infrastructure. But even that committee started to become polarized more and more. And, I spent half my career in the minority for the first, 10 or 12 or 14 years of that. There was still a fair amount of working across the aisle. Right now, basically it is, to be penalized for working across the aisle, except for rare cases.
Thank you, Peter. So I think Abby's going to raise the next question from our live stream.
Thanks for everybody joining us on the live stream. My question from one of our audience members is, What will prevent or hold back 1932?
Is that a guardrails question?
Is this like a question about, an analogy between now and the rise of the Nazis, or is it an analogy between FDR? I don't understand.
It is referring to Germany, I believe.
Okay, so
Yes.
this great. So I think this is a question about, what guardrails, and we've all kind of heard lots about Congress the first time around was quite skeptical, including Republicans. Now it's very different. But if you were to point to guardrails, do we have any that are sturdy and reliable or not? So federalism, the courts, Congress, that's how I would try to extrapolate that question. And if I got it wrong to our live stream person, I'm sorry, but. Yes, did everyone hear that from Rebecca? If you still have a card, hold it up and we'll come find you.
Oh, the guardrails are substantially eroded. Remember, he had people in his first administration who said no when he wanted to do unconstitutional things, use the military against civilians, Posse Comitatus Act and that. Those who, I think it was Mattis, who called him a fascist to the core. They have been vetting people, and the first question you have to answer is, was the 2020 election stolen? And if you say no, then you're out. And then they're making people submit their social media accounts. They're doing extensive background checks to find people who might, have a scintilla of, integrity, who wouldn't do exactly what Trump wants. And his plans for Schedule F and wiping out, the professional civil service, and then of course the courts. Supreme Court ruling on the presidents are immune for legal acts. Well, what's a legal act, and what are they going to say is illegal? And no, I think the guardrails are substantially, very, very much eroded. Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think our capacity to rely on the guardrails is certainly in question. I think the courts may still operate to be somewhat of a guardrail. Right, not every court case ends up at the Supreme Court. Federal court's doing a lot of work. So there's going to be a lot of federal court decisions that don't necessarily make it all the way up to the Supreme Court that will still have some heft. And states, right? State and local governments will be guardrails. Now, will they be guardrails to prevent some of the sort of bigger, heftier policy items that Trump wants to implement, things that are specifically in the wheelhouse of the federal government? Probably not. But a lot of the work of government, a lot of the work that we experience from government happens at the state and local level, and that will continue to be the case.
Okay, thanks, Regina.
I'll just add two things quickly. They're completely different. One is more hopeful, one is pretty dire in my mind. So I guess the more hopeful one is that there's a lot of research to suggest that when people have access to local news that's robust, that does a lot to counteract polarization, in addition, of course, to its accountability effects. So I would like to think that if we could really invest in local news, that might be one way to counteract this polarization-driven phenomenon that we're seeing at the federal level. So essentially, when people are asked to think like community members, to think like locals, they don't think like national polarized, partisans. So that's, I think, on a more hopeful note, although there's a lot that needs to be done with local news. I think the other thing, in answer to the question about, what prevents 1932, I guess the other thing I'd want to bring our attention to is that, fascism may be the aim. I think that kleptocracy is quite possible, and I think we would spend a lot of time focused on the fascist aspects and maybe be in danger of overlooking, like, to what purpose. And I think just my hunch tells me the kind of guy that Donald Trump is and his history in business says a lot about what we can expect.
I don't want to suggest that the comparison between Germany in 1932 and the United States in 2024 is wrong or anything like that. That's for you to decide for yourself. But I think I just want to propose that we shouldn't work ourselves up, right? Like it's important to keep operating, keep moving, and take things as they come and be realistic about what's likely to happen and realistic about things that you can do. If we start creating these horrible scenarios, then it can be debilitating. Now, that's if you dislike Trump and you want to, you know, be an obstacle. Now, if you like Trump, like you can clap your hands and enjoy his government. But if you dislike him, you know, I think that there's a frame of mind, a mentality that you can have that is productive and generative for political life. And then there's a frame of mind that's pessimistic and dour and cynical, in which it stops you from living your life. And we don't want that. We want you to feel good and go about your life and try to do something better. Don't get to a situation where you think it's hopeless and nothing's worth it, because that accomplishes nothing.
I know Allison wants back in. I want to say, so you can jump back in, but we've got a stack of cards. So I'm going to say the hardest thing for especially for the professors, I want 30-second answers. Okay? So go ahead, fire away, Quinn.
All right. Why do we see an increase in Gen Z male voters for Trump when Gen Z is assumed to be progressive?
The Gen Z question, and I want to also emphasize, fascinating question, right? And Allison and I have written about this. Think about Gen Z vote in 2020 and 2022, dramatically high compared to previous younger voters, and was incredibly impactful in terms of the Democratic victories in both years. So I love this question because it's asking what happened. I don't know who wants to take that on.
Wait, can you say the question again?
I mean, you know, I think so the part of the story about Gen Z is, right, there was a rightward shift of male voters under 30, right? So there's a really interesting graphic that I think CNN has where they look at 2016, 2020, and then 2024, and they look at age by gender, right, to see sort of who voted for whom. And there's definitely a sort of ratcheting to the right of male voters under 30. You know, what is that about? Who knows, right? I don't think that we could ever really say, and actually Dan and I have talked about this, right, that there was that Gen Z was necessarily progressive so much as they had policy ideas that they liked, and they voted for the folks that had the policy ideas that they liked. They were very much policy focused and candidate focused,
Not partisan.
and not partisan focused. So I don't think that this is like necessarily a deviation from the sort of partisan preferences. I think this is just Gen Z saying, this is who we like right now. And so who knows what that'll mean for some future candidate over some future time. But there is this very interesting men under 30 ratcheting to the right of the folks who voted, right? And again, right, part of this is a turnout issue, right? We have no idea how many of the 14 million folks who didn't come out to vote were a part of this particular, right, crew of people.
I think that
Amplifying the question really quick, something really specific. In terms of the bro vote or UFC vote, however you want to describe it, should Kamala Harris have appeared on the Joe Rogan show? Oh, is that on? How's that?
Yeah.
Okay, better, sorry. So to amplify, I got it, yep. To amplify, would it have made a difference if she did things like appear on the Joe Rogan show and so forth to appeal to the UFC and kind of bro vote? Because she wasn't that active in that regard.
Yeah, so I'm 32. I'm not terribly far away from the bro vote in terms of age and demographic. I played football in high school and college. You know, these are some of my friends, and you know, I think that we have to think about misogyny in this election. That can't be dismissed. Can't be dismissed. Trump ran on being a man and kind of made it seem unmanly, tried to make it seem unmanly to support Kamala. I also think it's important to recognize that the Democratic Party has, I think, not made it really compelling for the Democratic Party, a compelling home for young men. They haven't been trying to go out and get this vote. And her not showing up on Joe Rogan is a testament that she was either going to write it off or it just didn't matter, right? Lots of people watched Joe Rogan. He gave her an invitation. She didn't want to come. Why not? And I think, I'm someone who recognizes through my experience and through my studies that misogyny has been a part of our social fabric for a long time, and it's something that we should correct. But not every person has that same level of experience and knowledge. And so I think that there is work that the Democratic Party can do to make the Democratic Party a safe haven for guys who play football, watch basketball, drink beer, ride four-wheelers. Like it's gotta, if it's this case that you have to pass a certain litmus test in order to not get, castigated, in order to vote Democrat, then I think that means that your party is maybe a little bit too restrictive. If you're writing off entire demographics of people.
Great, thanks. So we have more questions. Our challenge is in 2 minutes. I want us to get through 2 questions. Okay, so go for it.
How can we bridge the gap of news Americans get / make unbiased news more accessible so that we can have conversations with a baseline of information?
That was a small question.
Yeah, that's right. $60,000 question. I think a lot of smart journalists are trying to figure that out right now. I also think the answer isn't going to lie just with conventional journalism. I think it's going to take other formats, other genres, other forms. I don't think the younger generation we were just talking about, I don't think they're necessarily going to be drawn to, they aren't drawn to the stuff that most of the people in this room think of as news. Not much of an answer, but I was supposed to be short, so.
Great. Next question.
What is the most significant impact of this election on young voters or the future of college students?
Impact on young voters and the future of college students. And as you ponder that, I'm going to throw out one thing too. It's kind of have a more positive way of thinking about things is maybe if you guys could tell audience members what they can do constructively to respond to the challenges ahead.
I kind of want to jump on the last question.
Do that first.
Okay. So I think the search for objective news is kind of a wrong-headed approach. You're not going to get that. Like everybody has their biases. I think the key is to develop and spread this notion of critical thinking. You've got to be able to read and evaluate various texts and information and then make informed decisions based off of evidence. That's something that you develop in class or you can develop in life, but it's something that we really try to emphasize here at the university. And so I think that, talking about the going out of public education, it's critically important that people develop these skills, these critical thinking skills, because without it, you are kind of subject to the whims of the media ecosystem.
Great. Allison.
Yeah, I think, the way forward is to focus on your communities, right? Is to build communities, is to engage in coalition building at the local level. This is something that the Democratic Party consistently fails at privileging and prioritizing in terms of its approaches, right? Liberals focus fully on the national level. And, there's definitely been progress made at the local level in mutual aid and community uplifting, but that has to be where the focus is, because that's ultimately going to get our most vulnerable communities through the next 4 years, but it's also going to have, right, a payoff in terms of how the Democratic Party reorganizes and how progressives reorganize.
Thanks. We have 2 minutes left for our event. So Mariana, please ask our next question.
Yeah, so this is kind of more like a personal question, but looking at the demographics for this election, I'm wondering if you have any theories on why there was such high voter turnout for Trump, specifically with the Latinx males. I was really, seeing those demographics, it was, yeah, I was just wondering if you guys had theories on that.
You just said Latinx. Latinos do not like that word. That is, a woke term, if you don't mind me using that phrase. And that's part of the problem with Democrats, is we aren't communicating with people in the way that they want to be communicated with, much more straightforward. So, that's, I really think sorry, I just got off on that. So I kind of forgot the gist of the question when you said Latinx, because go ahead.
Dr. O'Brien.
I think to add in there, it's some of the things that you are seeing across other demographic groups, such as education, polarization. Another thing that I think is underappreciated when analyzing the Hispanic and Latino vote is that it's a very young electorate. So in 2020, only 30% of the Latino vote in 2020 voted in 2008. And so it's changing. And then also thinking about immigrant groups across time is first generation, second generation, third generation. There is change that happens, and Hispanic immigrants that maybe were more democratic, their kids and grandkids look more like the rest of the voting population, and you saw that with Italian or Irish immigrants in past generations. And I think that's some of what we're seeing this cycle.
Thank you, Neil. So before I officially gavel this to a close, two quick things. If you have questions that didn't get answered in the pressing, my hunch is panelists will stick around if you want to come up and ask them those questions. As Rebecca pointed out, also, if you want to stay here afterwards to have a smaller conversation, folks can circle up in front. And last reminder, Sarah Nelson here at 6 o'clock next week, this room, same day. So with that, please join me in thanking our all-star panel.
Always gets so fast.